So welcome all of you to the book launches and to this evening session. This is going to be a far more chilled session, and there's some tea and coffee. You can bring your tea and coffee here. After the book launches, we're going to have a performance, and that means we'll have to go back upstairs. And then after that, there's a cocktail dinner. At the cocktail dinner, please network, mingle, eat, be merry, and then we'll see you tomorrow, same time, same place. So I'm going to start off by introducing the authors today. We have one discussant, Jessica, who is going to be in conversation with Siphokazi. But the first person to talk is Polo Moji. Polo Moji was the organizer for the last Afems conference, so it's nice to have her back here. And at that time, you were writing this book. You were just like, she was organizing and putting, full stops and dotting all her T's and I's. And Paula is going to talk about, her book is on gender and spatial blackness in contemporary Afro narratives. After that, it will be Siphokazi, Magadla, and Jessica. And Siphokazi is going to be talking about her book, Guerrillas and Combative Mothers. And Siphokazi was the keynote speaker for our second Afems. And this book comes out of that keynote. So it's so nice to see how these thoughts and ideas grow and are growing to published works. And then Tumi Mampane is going to talk about her book, Pentecostal Charismatic Women. I can't wait. Did you bring copies? Oh, sorry. And Danai Mupotsa is not here, but she has sent her talk, and Aya Mahlo is going to talk about, it's a special issue. It's a special issue in agenda on Black transnational feminisms and the question of structure. So you all have 20 minutes, I think? That, Charlene? 20 minutes to speak. So let's start off with Polo. I just said to Polo, I hope that you're going to shed some light into why France is burning at the moment. So welcome.
Do I hold? Oh. This is interesting. Wait, please keep me. Just be intimate with me. Yeah, and then I hold this. That's an issue. Okay, let me just hold this. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm better this way. Can I? No?
Yes.
This way?
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Uh-huh.
Do I even need a mic?
If you can shout. Yes.
Huh? Will you be able to hear me at the back? Okay, so we'll have to try and use this mic then. All right. This is such a pleasure for me to be here. Let me know if the intonation is not right. I'm not getting a sense of how loud I am or how soft I am. So there are two things that we need to think about. First of all, I'm a walker-talker. So sitting in this deep couch is stressing me out greatly. I want to be able to walk around and use my hands and my feet.
You can walk.
Huh?
You can walk.
Can I walk?
You can do whatever you want.
Good. Yeah. Okay. Because my book is about walking. So here we are. Let me start with this opening quote, and after that, we will get back to it. I'll circle back to it. So, walking helps me feel at home. Sometimes I walk because I have things on my mind. and walking helps me sort them out. I walk because it confers or restores a feeling of placeness. I walk because somehow it's like reading. You're privy to these lives and these conversations. I walk in the city side by side with the living and the dead. Now, this is a quote from Laura Elkin, whose book Flaneurs I use quite a lot in my own book, Gender and the Spatiality of Blackness in Contemporary Afro-French Narratives. Now, this baby of mine, all along, I've called it Black Flaneurs. It was conceived of as Black Flaneurs. And the idea of flannery, walking, wandering, strolling, right, asks certain questions about who has freedom of the city, right? Who can move in certain spaces. And of course, the flaneur, 19th century sort of white male figure in walking around Europe, gets reimagined as the flaneurs, gendered, and the Black flaneurs, right? And this is how I enter my discussion or my study of Afro-French narratives. And I think one of the things that Linda asked me is, why is France still burning? France has been burning for a long time, my friend. There have just been waves that are more or less in the media, right? And my own book starts in 2005, during the 2005 protests, because some of the questions have been, being located where you are, why would this have been something you studied? And it's lived experience. 2005, October 2005, I was a student in France doing my master's. And as students do, I got a part-time job. And that job was teaching in a banlieue school, a high school, about 5 zones outside of central Paris, so peripheral Paris. And of course, being there and traveling on the train in the mornings and seeing whose bodies get on and whose bodies are traveling that long distance out to the periphery. It was uncanny. And that uncanniness was apartheid spatiality, was how certain bodies travel longer distances to get to places of work, to get to the center for whatever reason, right? What it means and what it costs for certain bodies to come into the city, right? To access. And it was interesting because I was a foreign student. I was living in the city, in the CTU. So there was a way in which mapping my own trajectory in the mornings, right, started to make me think about my students. Because when I asked my students, they'd be like, oh, madam, we can't, there'd be issues around being checked for identity, if you're traveling in big groups, question of cost, the metro tickets, etc., etc. And I found the wording interesting, the wording around space. So you've got the center of Paris, intramuros, within the walls, within the city walls. You've got the boulevard périphérique, the periphery, that surrounds, I'd say maybe tries to protect the city walls. And then you've got the banlieue, which, it's, I don't want to flatten it and say all banlieue are the same, all banlieue are migrant neighborhoods, etc. But what you're seeing is a spatialization where those with the least resources are most likely to be furthest away, right? So it is not, some people would say, translate banlieue as suburbs. It is not the suburb. Suburb means something else. So that's where I am. There are many layers to this project. Some of the layers to this project are also because I myself am now the mother of a young Black French daughter. And I need to give her the language to negotiate what that means, which makes this a very personal project for me as well. What I'm going to do today is 2 things. I'm going to read some extracts to give us a sense of what the book is about. and also outline some of the ways in which I approach the study. So the Black question. The Black question in France that comes up every time we see these protests in the media. Every time it's like it's new, right? And here I'm quoting Pape Ndiaye, who's a leading scholar of Black studies in France, who asserts that the increasingly public demands of people who identify themselves as Black has produced a heightened visibility in France that, in inverted commas, invents la question noire, invents the Black question, question in contemporary France. And as others have noted, primarily Rama Yad, who was Secretary of Human Rights in 2007 to 2009, she observes in her book, Noirs de France, Black People of France, that the French media saw Black people everywhere after the 2005 banlieue protests. What sparked those protests? A group of boys walking home early evening in a neighborhood of Clichy-sous-Bois, banlieue, see the police coming towards them and they know they don't have their IDs. Two of them hide out in an electrical substation. Three of them, actually. The two died. And there was one survivor. The question is, why would these children think they needed to run away, walking home, right, in their neighborhood? And so the protest that arose said, mort pour rien, died for nothing, right? And starting from Clichy-sous-Bois, they spread across the country. Died for nothing. It's so much like what happened last week. Was it 2 weeks ago with Nael, right? Outside of Nanterre, I think it is, where he was also stopped, was a traffic stop, and he ends up being shot, right? For what? Because he didn't want to, he didn't stop. They say he didn't stop. The police claim that he tried to drive towards them in a menacing manner, whereas the video shows that the guy just shot him through the window, right? These stories surface over and over again. But what is interesting has been the languaging around Blackness, right? This fantasy that Black violence somehow poses a threat to the white bourgeoisie or to the intramuros, right? And Ramayad, who's quite interesting because she's a political figure, was a political figure and has written about it. She thinks about, in a chapter called Le Black, fier d'être française, question mark, français, question mark, the Black, proud to be French. She describes a sort of media imaginary of Le Black, always written in English, so easily conflated with stereotypes of the African American ghetto, of hip hop culture, etc. And that is interesting. The linguistic distancing of noir, Black in French, which for the longest time while I was a student was not acceptable socially to use, with Le Black, which circulated more easily, right? What does it mean when you cannot or when you do not express racial difference in your language, in your own language, right? Where you have to pass by this conduit of a globalized Blackness via English, right? To get to think about your race, right? France is one of the countries that does not keep racialized statistics, right? So you don't have language and you don't have the statistics to think about your lived experience, really, and to make a case around it. And this is one of the, I think for me, it's one linguistic, this linguistic displacement, which is increasingly changing, I think, says something about the ethos or the myth of colorblind Europe. Racial violence, police violence happens in the US, it happens in South Africa, it happens elsewhere, but we're too civilized for this to happen to us, in our space, right? It is a linguistic sleight of hand that renders being black and French in some ways unsayable, right? And I'm going to quote from a scholar that some of you may know, Mabula Samohoro, um, who writes, and I'll just quote it in French and then translate it because so much of what I was doing was thinking through work that is not necessarily available in English and trying to write it in English language. Quand on parle de nous, on parle d'immigration. Or, on n'est pas d'immigrés. On va parler des Noirs. On va parler des races en s'appuyant sur les États-Unis alors qu'on n'est pas des Américains. Donc, si tu es noir et français, noir et de couleur, noir ou noir et non blanc, tu n'as pas tellement de place. So I will translate. When they speak of us, they speak of immigration. Yet we're not immigrants. They will speak of black people. They will speak of race with reference to the United States. Well, we are not American. So if you're black and French, black and of color, or black and non-white, you literally don't have a place, right? So these articulations then sort of at the same time sort of show how le black is in one way erases a certain sort of lived experience, but at the other hand also sort of claims a sort of relationality, right, with transnational blackness, right? There's a thinking through as well that occurs maybe topographically and linguistically. In the book, it was a terrible challenge because I had to work out, I'm writing black in English, but then some of the texts written in French say le black, right? And how to signal that, well, you'll have to read the book to figure out what I did with it. Because I also needed to show how the two relate, are constantly in relation and feeding off each other in very interesting ways. So let's think about the spatiality of blackness then. I've spoken about the banlieue and intramurals. What does it do when we don't tell a banlieue story of blackness, right? In France, the banlieue has become a pejorative shorthand for generalizing expressions. Le problème de banlieue, la crise de banlieue, right? Problems, crisis. So it is constantly a site of problems, of crisis. And of course, there's the political organization of these labels, a logic which I say is of spatial containment, right? Even contamination, right? Because somehow there is idea of disruption, potential disruption of the social order emanating from these spaces. So while there have been many books and films, I think we've seen some really famous films like La Haine, for example, and many others that show French blackness in the banlieue. How many of us see French blackness in Paris city center, right? And there is that idea of seeing and spatialization. So this difference being read on the body that then spatializes or places you, right, in the imaginary, either there or here, stranger, right, always a stranger to the nth generation, always just arrived, always an immigrant, regardless of how many generations, all right? And of course, the labeling of belonging and citizenship, Français de souche, which is French of origin, I'd say it's almost like DNA, right, of the root, versus Français d'origine. You're both citizens, but a Français d'origine means that you'll always be asked, what are your origins? To the nth generation, read on your body. And that was the thing I learned from my students at that school that year, was so many of them had never been to the so-called origin, right? Point of origin. And yet they would always in their day-to-day life have to answer the question about origins. So that's one of the things. And the second element was the gendered element. So much of the imaginary of the spectacular of blackness in France is not just about the banlieue, it's also around the police brutality aimed at who? Young black men. So what happens to women in the story of black spatiality? That's where I entered. That was my point of entry, right? And I'm not going to quote it, but I used Saadia Hartman's, I think, very elegant articulation of strolling as an everyday choreography of the possible. To really think about the possibilities of spatial liberty, the cartographies of containment, the notions of wandering and errantry, right? Notions around spatial segregation, internal, external borders, real and imagined borders, right? Because Hartman links strolling to the map of what could or what might be, right? So I think in attending some of these Afro-European conferences over the years, what I discovered and what really frustrated me was as much as the work of Black European women was being read and engaged with in these very particular spaces, it was so depoliticized, right? It wasn't taking on the politics of race, the politics of claiming space, of claiming European space, right? And so there's an intervention more on a field level, if you will, in terms of the debate that I wanted to make around the politics of place, of saying I am in place. You're seeing me. I'm not the figure of the stranger. You see me as being in place. And with the excerpts I'm going to read, luckily, given my hand thing, I've got them here and I don't have to open my book. I'll show you the book afterwards. Are from the work of Leonora Miano, who I use in chapter 3 to really think through and problematize some of these questions around the unsayability of Blackness. Leonora Miano, what's interesting in her work is that the novels that deal with the African continent, I think her Africa trilogy has been easily translated into English. You will find it. Her work that speaks to being Black in France, nothing. Silence. Nobody's picking it up. Right? So she says these profound things, and linguistically we don't access them. We don't bring them in conversation with some of the things that we're reading about the Caribbean, about the US, about us here. And once again, I'll quote, because she's speaking to this notion of being Français de souche versus Français d'origine, the question of origin, the everyday question of origin. In a little tract called Binarité, Binarity, I see Linda writing time. Am I running out of time?
Yes.
Le pays dit noir ou française. Le pays dit qu'on ne peut qu'être que noir ou française. La pensée du pays est binaire, polarisante, limitée. Elle résonne comme une sommation. La pensée du pays sans la fin du pays. La France ne sera plus la France si elle dit noire et française. So the country says Black or French. The country says one can only be Black or a Black or French woman. The thinking of the country is binary, polarizing, limited. It echoes like a warning. The thinking of the country feels the end of the country. France will no longer be France if it says Black and French. She writes beautifully. And because Linda is already going to hurry me along, I think what I want to think about here is a particular collection of her work called Écrit pour la parole, 2012, which is, I think in terms of form, just genre bending in the most beautiful ways. It's philosophical with these sort of tracts, these vignettes. She plays with grammar, no grammar. She and interspersed with fictional sort of interludes that illustrate some of the things that she's thinking about. And in a particular section, it's divided into two parts. And the first part, the first section has a little, I'll say a well, okay, in the middle called pièces d'identité, pieces of identity. Within the same section, these little fictional bits are surrounded by essays called couleur, color, and they sort of arc all the way through to community. And in pieces of identity, we have these voices. We don't know who they are, but the sense is that they're responding to the question, where do you come from? What are your origins? So we have Ure. Ure seems to respond to a question about her unusual name by painstakingly mapping her lineage. Having established her identity as Parisian, she traces a family tree that includes a great-grandmother, a native of the French city of Le Havre, who married her great-grandfather, who was born in the Senegalese port city of Rufisque, when it was still considered a region of France. And then she goes on to think through her mother's lineage, who's from Vietnam, and how her mother changed her name to Justine, in order to avoid it being mangled in French. So Ure illustrates the negotiations that take place around cultural assimilation, the names that her parents have to change. Her father's name is called Pierre outside in the street, but Moussa at home. Her story also thinks about how the national limits, the very idea of what French territory was, has changed over time. Thinks about the colonization of Senegal and of Vietnam, and brings that all into one story, one response to the complexity of her name. And then I'm going to read Susten. How many?
Time up.
Please give me 5. Thank you. I want to. I'm just going to take 5. I'm so sorry. So let's think about Susten, who tries to respond to a question about the potential loss of her French citizenship. I really want to say this one because I think it's something that happens. I mean, we know the Windrush story of how people lose their British citizenship, but let's think about the same thing happening in France, right? And I'll read just an extract here. I read L'Equipe and the Parisienne. What more should one do? I had my nationality and everything was going well. The other day, I went to submit my application for the renewal of my identity card. I was told that my father's birth certificate was missing. Born in Pointe-Noire. There was damage to my house 2-3 years ago. I lost some documents. It can happen. And since the children are French, and I've lived in the 18th arrondissement for a long time, I told myself, this will be quickly resolved. And yet it's not. And it goes on to talk about what happens to her as she realizes that unless she produces this document that was, in a damaged house, she risks leaving her grandchildren there in France and being sent back somewhere else. So what I think I'm going to wrap up with is one more thing, Linda, and then I'm going to go. Is how then this is felt when one is walking, right? I talked about walking the city. And in the second part of Écrit pour la parole, Leonora Miano has a section titled Femme in the City. So women in the city, and she uses the English and the French at the same time. And once again, we have several portraits of women, sometimes silent women in the metro being watched by somebody else who are of Caribbean origin, of Antilles. But I was struck by this particular portrait of a woman coming out of the RER station, the train station in central Paris, in Les Halles. And Les Halles is really at the center of Paris. It was called the belly of Paris, for many years. But it's also where the biggest station, bringing people from the banlieue into central Paris, is located. And so you always have this traffic of people moving in and out. And this is a woman wearing a veil, young Muslim woman, walking out. And she goes, in the Halles, They are Roma people. At the Port Lescott, Roma women, they rushed towards me. You'd think they were waiting for me particularly. They spontaneously approach Black women. I notice this every time I pass that way. Black women must clearly carry a visible burden. And this idea of coming out from this underground belly into the street and thinking about her veil, saying Black, obviously, not a white one, right? In this Republican space where what public signs of religion, right? Religious symbols should be kept to your private space, right? The law, I don't know whether some of you know the laws around the veil in France. And so and the interesting thing about this section is that it's all I. It's all this slippery sort of I with no grammar, almost like a consciousness, a stream of consciousness that Miano uses to sort of enact this embodied negotiations around space. And so I'm going to end with those words again. Walking helps me feel at home, Linda. Sometimes I walk because I have things on my mind, and walking helps me sort them out. I walk because it confers or restores a feeling of placeness, and I say for who? For who? Thank you. So everyone, this book is a Routledge book. Pounds and dollars. But I've put cards there at the back next to Mtunzi with the link, thank you, with the link to the site where there's an e-version, and I see they've now got the paperback out, which is a far more reasonable price. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Polo. Now we're going to have a discussion between Siphokazi and Jessica.
Who is alive?
Who is alive?
Yes.
And here now. So
You know what to hold. Okay. I don't know how to introduce myself. Hello, everybody. My name is Jessica Lejoa. I am currently a PhD candidate for art history and visual culture. So the reason Siphokazi and I are chatting is because we've been chatting for over a decade about this kind of material, how we can study it, where we can study it. And today we're chatting because my kind of area that I want to explore is around generating a visual and oral archive of women who are unsung but were part of Umkhonto weSizwe and Azanian National Azanla Fushfort. So the ones that we don't know, whose faces we don't know, whose voices we would not easily recognize. And then I would like to also interact with their artifacts, their keepsakes from the time in that horrific moment in history. So we're talking about, these are the conversations that happened between us. Okay, so I have a couple of questions because I have read the book and it's so deceptively easy to read. You can just get through it in 3 days, and understand everything. But when you return, that's when the belly of it hits you. Anyway, the first question that I'd like to pitch to you is, where did it come from?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. It's really wonderful to be here. And as Linda said earlier, in 2018, I gave my very first keynote address in life at Afems. It really propelled this work, and it is these conversations. I remember walking to Barrett. I think that's where we were walking for lunch. And Professor Zetumatebeni said, you know, this idea, I presented what is now the last chapter from Ukuzabalaza to Utabalaza. And I was working with this idea that these women liberation fighters have actually moved from a life of struggle to a life of hustling, trying to make sense of their lives under the context of neoliberal African informality. And she said, you must think about that. And I did go and think about it. But where the book comes from is really from my own wounding. Polo was talking about how she comes into her project, also now as a mother of a French daughter. I come to this project as the daughter of a former soldier of the Transkei Defence Force, who was integrated into what is supposed to be the new South African Defence Force, but what is really a reproduction of the old Afrikaner South African Defence Force, SADF. So my father integrated, and because the new democratic government understood that this army was too big, because they brought 7 armies into one. And as Tumi says, it was brought together at midnight on the 27th of April in 1994. That's how the new defense force is born. So in bringing together 7 armies, they understood that they needed to shrink the army, decrease it. And so my father was one of those who was convinced to take an early pension at the age of 38. So I'm turning 37 in December. My mother was 35 when my father retired. I'm the firstborn, so she had to deal with being the person who has the income at home, 3 children, and to figure it out. And so my childhood is made up of watching my father, whom I used to watch with his military uniform, whistling. And my father is a tall, fairly good-looking man. I used to admire watching him, and then sort of seeing the transition then to this man who spent his days reminiscing about life in the military with his friends as they were drinking. While my mother, who worked at the Mthatha General Hospital in the psychiatry ward, came back home with stories of military men, former soldiers, that they had to tie down in order to medicate because they had lost their mind. And so this comes from that, trying to make sense of what happens to soldiers, really what happens to men after war. And so I didn't understand at that time what was happening. But when I worked with Cheryl Hendricks at the Institute for Security Studies, then becoming familiar with the literature around security sector transformation, I understood what was happening to my father. He was not an exception. But what I didn't understand was, why was it that they didn't have women colleagues? There were no stories of these women liberation fighters, or women soldiers for that matter, whether in the Transkei Defence Force or elsewhere. And so when I interviewed Minister Thandi Modise in 2010, it really was the first time that I began to understand that for me to understand really what happened to my father's generation, I needed to understand the armed struggle itself. And I needed to understand what women did, how women understood the turn to the armed struggle. And so it really was Modise who, at the time when she left, she was 16 years old in high school. And she says, I live with a group of 10 young people. And she explains the reasons that she left. She says she left for 3 reasons. She was inspired by the Soweto generation. She said, we looked at those kids in Soweto because in Mupotsa, where she was, they were dealing with Bantu authority, with Mangope. So she says, we were about to lose the very little bit of citizenship that we could make a claim to. So she was fighting against Bantu authority, but she had been raped at the age of 15 and had been impregnated. And she says, the justice system failed me and my mother. And then she was fighting against Bantu education. She says, I went for those 3 reasons at the age of 16, crossing the borders to go to Angola. So this book comes from that place.
Comes from a deep place. It comes from many places. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So following on to that, I don't think I'll keep the structure that I had imagined. And so because you were looking at where the stories of women were, because you interviewed someone who sparked that initial kind of curiosity, how do you think, or how have they expressed, the women that you've spoken with, that you've interviewed, how do they feel about the making of this book? And how do they feel about the process of the interviews? What is the root for their desire to participate in telling such personal stories?
Maybe you can hold the microphone for me.
Mm.
I just want to read from the book a poem by Makosaza Nakaba, who is a former combatant of Umkhonto weSizwe and one of the women I interviewed. It is from her poem that I borrow the title of the introduction, Our Lips No Longer Sealed. So it says, they wanted us to tell and listen before our wounds healed, as if they didn't know that the thunder of pain is deafening. They didn't even notice that our lips were sealed. We need to move on, they said, and got laws repealed. They tried to make us believe that the truth was beckoning. We'd prefer waiting, we said, until our wounds have healed. One after the other, the stories of other people were revealed. In time, the processes and the performances started settling. By then, no one really cared that our lips were still sealed. Naughty stories were unpicked, their multiple layers unpeeled. Some truths were deadening, others left audiences trembling. We watched, firm in our resolve to speak after our wounds were healed. Audiences saw through some perpetrators telling and squirreled. The performance had to go on. The world was watching and questioning. By then, no one really cared that our lips remained sealed. Years later, our wounds healed. The truth is our shield. We open up to be heard. For us, this act will be strengthening. After all, today many seem to agree that before our wounds healed, we could not talk and listen. So here we are today, our lips no longer sealed.
I love it. And I think it brings us back to what you said, Polo, earlier about the very long distances that certain bodies have to travel to get to the center. And I think trauma, pain, sealed lips are very long distances. So what's happening here is that we are arriving at the center. The women who fought for this country have taken that long walk to arrive and to create the center. It's lovely. I do want to ask you, I don't know who has a copy and who doesn't, but the cover, here's the visual artist. How did you decide that these are the images that will go on the cover and that they would be juxtaposed in the way that they are?
It's a really fantastic question. So initially, I had thought, because inside the book there's about 8 pages of images. So I'd initially thought we'll have like a collage, so that you could see all or most of the women that I interviewed, most of the 40. And one of the books I had in mind, and I remember sending a picture of this cover to the publisher. It's one of my favorite books, Lives of Courage, Women for a New South Africa. And I like that you can see these women that Diana Russell interviewed. But in that process, it became too busy. It wasn't possible to do it because unlike this one, so she took these images herself after the interviews. The ones that I have, some are from exile, some are from later on. So it became challenging to have that. But when we settled on these 2 elders, Nomvo Boy and Ruth Mompati, for me, it was a nod, I would say, to the women from 2 political traditions that were there from the beginning. So Nomvo Boy, who is part of the generation of the ANC Youth League that leaves the ANC in '59 to form the PAC, who is one of the people that are arrested after Sharpeville, even though she was not in Gauteng but was in the Eastern Cape, lived as a dressmaker in Queenstown, arrested for having a letter from a friend from exile, and leaves at the age of 53 to go to Tanzania to train as a combatant, as a liberation fighter, and tells her daughters, she says to them, I've raised you enough, I've taught you the things that you need to know, I must go and fight. In the public imagination, and certainly I think in academic literature as well, the image of the woman guerrilla, when she does appear, it is the image of the MK woman guerrilla. And so it was important to me to use this beautiful picture of Mam Nomvo Boy that shows up, that is used also in the chapter that she writes about her own life in Prodigal Daughters, Stories of South African Women in Exile, where she's standing in Tanzania with her fist clenched, standing tall. So that was important for me, to nod to say, even in the founding, because when people like Tom Lodge, and even in Kwadiwe Gondlo's book about the PAC, when they talk about the Polo insurrections, they don't talk about people such as Nomvo Boy, who was also arrested for having addressed a meeting in Mkanduli, and I interviewed women elders in Mkanduli who were there in '63. And so it was to say also to feminist scholars, and as I said to you, Jessica.
Oh, don't worry.
Because initially, and I hope it's okay to say this, you had wanted to look at MK women. And I said, what about Azanla women? What about Apla women, right? And so it's also an invitation. And then with Mompati, and I like that she's sitting, she's taking a picture. And this is an image from 1962 in the Soviet Union. She is one of the founders of the Federation of South African Women, one of the organizers of the 9 August 1956 march. She is asked, the ANC sends Walter Sisulu to ask her to go and train in the Soviet Union. Surely there's something about this woman for her to be asked. And in terms of our records, it seems she is the first woman to be asked to go and train in the Soviet Union. But in the public imagination, she's known as the secretary of Mandela in Tampa. Right.
I think that's...
And maybe I might just add, next year we will have the Ruth Mompati lecture hosted by the politics department next year. And I hope in the future, learning from colleagues at Nelson Mandela University, what they are doing with the Ntantala and Mabela lecture, I do hope that perhaps we could change it, possibly to a Mompati Boy lecture, to bring these political traditions. Amapoko, ANC tradition, FETSO, women's tradition, ANC Women's League, all of those histories into conversation.
Conversation is a good idea. That threw me. Um, because the cover does feel like a conversation to me, but it also feels like an acknowledgement that women soldiers can record, write, speak, draw, take pictures of their own experiences. It is not time anymore for them to sit and wait for someone to come and interview. They're speaking out. Lips are no longer sealed. I really enjoy this cover. And then one thing that I kind of picked up as I read through some of these stories was that Abomama are either telling you their stories with humor, or you can hear a great deal of anger that perhaps over the years turned into irritation and I'm over it. But there's also some stoicism there. So I wonder if you were able to see whether those reactions to repeated arrests and torture and such was that an evolution to cope, or is it a personality thing, or is it perhaps that time has passed and we can laugh a little bit, or we can be irritated by the MKVA rather than be enraged? I don't know. An example is the one woman who tells a story of how in detention a group of white policemen threatened to rape her one after the other. And she used humor in that moment. She said, okay, well, finally I get to have sex with white men and I won't be arrested for it, right? But there's also, like I said, that stoicism, telling about detention and the conditions, but with very little drama. It's just a story. What are you thinking now? And we have 3 minutes left.
Sure. I think maybe it's all the above, I would say. With the story of the woman who's arrested and is threatened with gang rape by these white police officers. I imagine her as someone who, because it's one of it's a quote from Lives of Courage. I imagine that she had been arrested many times, and so she had learned some of the ways to cope. To resist, or should I say refuse? And so I imagine her in that way. In one of the conversations, Sister Bohang Pego asked if, what do we make of women, whether it's in the context of liberation movements, women joining this, joining guerrilla armies. And one of the women elders, almost dismissively says, well, we were there. And I imagine that, just like another generation of women, I imagine that the Follis women will say 30 years, if someone says, how could you join, this movement when you had misogynists, when you had rapists? They'll say, well, we were at the university. It was our university to fight for. We were there. Why are we the ones being made to explain the misogyny of our peers? And so that's really my understanding, and that's why I try to unpack the term Mzana? What does it mean to call the MK woman combatant Umzana? Where does this term come from? What does it tell us about the kind of girl, woman that the society imagines? And I make the point that if we understand this term, which emerges from the Eastern Cape, that comes from a social context where the girl child is raised to be industrious, is raised by a kutane, because it's not a great thing to be labeled as lazy. She's raised to be industrious. How do we expect her then, in the context of liberation, not to be industrious? So I make the argument that in this context, what is in her mind, even as she's harassed, she's tortured. One of the women I interviewed from Makanda, she says, I don't know how many homes I slept in Makanda because I couldn't sleep at home because the police were looking for me. And eventually, after a year in solitary confinement, she leaves the country. But I imagine in her head that there was no other option other than liberating the country. And so when you look at the collection Malibongwe, there's that generation of 76. I mean, there's one of the poems there, it's called No Childhood in Soweto. And so I make the point that apartheid presents a paradox about childhood. So at once, the generation of 76 lives to defend the right of children to be children. On the other hand, in the eyes, they are also fighting to be adults. Because in the eyes of the apartheid regime, black people, black women and men are always children.
Thank you for that. I want to sandwich two observations, questions, because we literally have -5 minutes now. I enjoy how you translate the raw qualitative data of, the pensions, the amounts, people's ages when they left the country and what it meant for them to come back. I love how you translate that into the very real and immediate lived experiences. This is actually what the numbers mean for the quality of my life. I think you do it beautifully. But the last question was, how did you build that rapport with Abu Mama? From the first conversation, because I can hear, they confide in you, they joke with you, they let you see their anger. How did you do it?
I think it's time, because I started to do interviews in 2013. So the project is 10 years old. And so I think it's time in a number of ways. So when Nompumelelo was presenting about Mamtsiki Biko earlier, and she says the last interview she gave was to Mfundi Mvundla in 2002, you said, and she ended it abruptly. I also wondered then, when you showed up, if because time had passed, she was ready to say some things that she couldn't say in 2002. I sort of wondered if that was a part of it. And so in the scholarship in Zimbabwe, time is also a factor. The first film shows up in 95 Flame. Most of the scholarship comes 15 years later. I show up in their lives almost 20 years later. And so I think time had something to do with it. It's time for their wounds to heal. I mean, the story that Makosi Taba tells is that, when Catherine Burns, the historian, told her that there's this young woman in Makanda doing this research, she says she had received so many requests from mostly foreign researchers, mostly white men, and she had decided enough now. So when she was told about me, she said, well, it's a young woman, I'll meet her. And she can have her own interpretation, but because she's a black woman, I'll talk to her. And so one of the things that Ambassador Tendrim Dizo says in the foreword, she says, who tells the story is important. So I think it's also linked to that. And so what's been exciting about the publication of this book is that some who I think didn't believe, so they believed she's doing something. They didn't quite believe the book would come to life. And now, one of them, she's always sharing my posts on Facebook. I think she really didn't believe it would happen. And now she says she's writing her memoirs. So she's part of a project. In April, we were with 16 women veterans from Abla, Azanla, and Mkodo Wesizwe. And it's learning from this, what Mam Loretta Ngobo did in Prodigal Daughters, where we brought the elders together in a writing workshop where they write chapters about their lives. And I think the book coming out sort of showed them that actually the country is interested to listen to their stories. And they are the people to tell the stories. I mean, we were with two at the Forge in Joburg, and about 91 copies were sold, and they couldn't believe it. And so now it's for a number of them, it's clear that they are also running out of time, and that if they don't say, to have their own record, it doesn't matter how we interpret it, but should they have their own record, they are also running out of time. So Ambassador Mtito says this, that the youngest recruit in MK was 1988, and she's not young anymore, that young recruit. So we are running out of time.
Thank you so much. Thank you for carrying and it's been a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Jessica,
everyone.
for that engaging conversation with the book. I've read the book. I think it's sold out in Joburg. It's sold out in the first book launch here at the university. I'm sure it's sold. Tunes, is it sold out here? Yeah. It's sold out in Nelson Mandela University as well. So make sure you get a copy. Thank you so much. Now we're going to listen to Tumi, and Tumi is going to talk to us about we're going to Pentecostal charismatic women. I can't wait to hear this.
All right. Thank you, everybody. My name is Tumi Mampane. The book that I wrote is Pentecostal Charismatic Women, Constructions of Femininity in Alexandra Township. So it is centered around Pentecostal women in Alexandra Township. Before I get into the who's and how's of the book, I'm just going to read one of my favorite excerpts from the book, which says, finally, the charismatic women of Alexandra Township build strong bonds with each other. When they tell their stories to me in groups, I catch glimpses of familiarity in the other women, which suggests that they have heard the accounts before. They believe that God has placed them together to be sisters in prayer, advice, general life choices, celebrations, parenthood, and happiness. In each other, they find what they search for, a God who loves, validates, listens, sees, and wants their happiness and success. So when I started, before I started to write this as a book, it was my entry back into academia as an honors student, and I was always very interested in what Christianity does in society, right? Especially because in South Africa, the stats say that 80% of South Africans actually identify as Christian. And I always thought, what is this actually going to mean for feminism? If 80% of people say we're Christian, and Christianity is in and of itself practiced in very patriarchal and misogynistic ways, what kind of dent can feminism actually make to that? And that's how I started this project. I first started to look at sermons, at the different kinds of sermons that have been given, right? And I was very interested also in sort of comparing, or rather juxtaposing sermons from men and from women against each other to see if there's any sort of progress that's being made by the entry of women into pastoral spaces. And to talk about women in pastoral spaces, I first have to, maybe to those of you who don't, who've only ever heard of Pentecostalism via stories of Bushiri and the like, then that's another important part of the book, right? Where I actually speak about Pentecostalism, its origins, and what it is within smaller communities, so that the first picture that people get of what a Pentecostal charismatic space is not necessarily the mega church, right? Because as much as mega churches receive all of this attention, even in scholarship, they receive a lot of attention, they do not make up the majority of what Pentecostal spaces are. Even in America, the average Pentecostal church has about 25 members. And in South Africa, it's much the same. So other scholars have referred to the kinds of churches I look at as sort of mushroom churches. It comes across as a complaint, like they mushroom everywhere, like at every single corner you're going to find them. But I think that those spaces are very important because A, like I said, they are actually the majority of Pentecostal churches, and B, they also allow for different types of theologies to actually be born. And that brings me to my discussion about women. So where in mainline churches and also mega churches that are founded by men, a lot of the narrative that always comes out and the rhetoric that always comes out is that in the early church women were not allowed to lead, which those of us who study these things know is a lie, especially feminist theologians who really go deep into it, right? But when it comes to these smaller churches, what happens is that there's a sort of shift in the air because of the fact that these churches can mushroom everywhere. So you find more women pastors because if you tell them that in the early church, Paul told the Corinthian women to sit down, they'll say, okay, since you want me to sit down at your church, I would rather mushroom somewhere else and start my own church. And they will then have like a very big chance of being followed by even half of the congregation. And it's happened that way, sometimes with divorces in Pentecostal churches, where there's been a divorce between a pastor and his wife, half of the church have actually left with the wife because they believe that she actually has a real calling, right? So I wanted to know then what these women do in these pastoral spaces that they occupy. And I found with the discourses and sermons that, yes, it is more likely for women in pastoral positions to actually be more feminist, though they will never, ever actually admit to being feminist, right? My mother is a pastor, and she uses a lot of what we would actually call feminist terms and feminist language. But the minute you say to her, you're a feminist, she loses it. She doesn't understand what to do with that, right? But also, that also means that somehow the women in churches, and there are more women in churches than there are men, get caught up in in patriarchal language, though they do understand feminist language and sometimes use that feminist language to resist what actually oppresses them in churches. And that's the next part of what I talk about. So I interviewed women in Pentecostal churches in Alexandra to try to understand how they embody what they are taught in church, how they apply it elsewhere in society, at their workplaces, and so forth, and what it is that they take from the sermons, because that's another thing, right? And that also comes up in scholarship a lot, is that um, church members are spoken of as these passive people who are always just taking in what is being given to them. Um, but in understanding agency and the work of agency, even within church spaces, then we get to understand that these women are always making decisions themselves, even when they're listening to these sermons. So they make decisions about whether or not they are actually going to take what pastor has said to them. One of the women I interviewed actually said to me, what's good for me, ingenala, and what's not good, ipumala, right? And I'll just translate that for those who don't know Zulu. Said, what's good for me goes into one ear, and I make sure it stays, and what's bad for me swiftly goes out the other ear, because I don't really care for it. And those are the sort of decisions that they make. So in looking and exploring femininity with these women, I also had to look. I used Black feminism, African feminism, and womanism, especially because, and I had to bring womanism and especially Black feminist theology into the conversation, because I also did not want to do what other, more sociological or philosophical work on Pentecostalism has done, and that is sort of dismiss the spirit element, right? Or talk about spiritual acts or people's spirituality as if it was this through an anthropological lens that sees it then as more of a performance than an experience, and what people actually are and how they actually live out their everyday lives. Um, and it was helpful for me to do that, because when I started to do this project, um, my supervisor at the time said to me, well, you must just buckle down, because the literature review is going to be what you hate the most about doing this work. And he was right, because the literature review was what I hated the most about doing the work. But what helped with having Black African feminist work and womanist work and Black feminist theology as my grounding theoretical framework is that part was not hard, right? What was hard for me was reading anthropological work and then finding that even though I grew up in a Pentecostal space, I couldn't see myself in that work. That's what made it hard. But the minute I read Black feminist theology, when I read scholars like Danai, Mupotsa, Patricia Hill Collins, Pumladi Newakola, then I saw myself. And then I thought, but then, okay, how do I marry these two spaces, or do they even marry at all, right? Because, Pentecostalism is a controversial topic, especially in South Africa. So I wondered, how I get to speak about African feminism and also speak about Pentecostalism in the same book, right? And speak of them as as things that actually can come together and help us with a lot of things. One of the big conversations that came about when I was speaking with these women and how they root themselves in spirituality was actually the dress code. And this was because I had noticed that a lot of the women actually use scarves to cover themselves if they feel like their skirts run up their legs when they're sitting down. I also was very interested in that topic from a very young age, because I think I used to sing at church. My brother and I used to sing together, and we'd been doing that for a very long time. So I think I was 12 years old um, when and my mom liked to dress me in like skimpy clothes, right? Because and the reason she actually dressed me in skimpy clothes was because she said I was too skinny, so I would disappear in anything else, right? So the skimpy clothes was a way to show that, you know, she's still alive, she's still there, type thing, right? So I used to wear skimpy clothes even at church. So I was 12 years old when my brother and I were singing in church, and then when we went to sit down, an older woman ran up to me in view of the whole church, and she threw a scarf over my legs to show that, okay, I'm being inappropriate or whatever, right? And so that topic always was very interesting to me, the why the scarves. And of course, then my mom had a whole sermon about scarves and you know how it is men that are supposed to gouge out the sinful eye rather than a young girl being approached with a scarf to cover up her body. Feminist, right? Yeah. When I spoke to these women, two very interesting takes actually came from them when it came to the scarf and the covering up of the body. And both takes actually went on, were based on their spirituality. So, on the one hand, we found women who said, dressing in skimpy clothes or wearing clothes that show too much of your skin. And of course, you know, we can debate forever about what too much skin is, right? So wearing skimpy clothes, they would say, is more showing yourself as a prostitute. And in feminist work, we find, you know, this whole idea of what a prostitute is, meaning that it's not just about sex work, right? It's what women are labeled when they are considered to be deviant, or too questioning or too loud, right? Or too alive in their skimpy clothes. Um, so, so that was the one hand where they said, look, I can't present myself as a prostitute if I'm coming to church. There has to be a difference between me and the girl on the street. And that's what the Spirit requires of me. And on the other hand, then I found women who said, look, what the Spirit requires of me is spiritual work. So what I wear and how I present myself cannot possibly have anything to do with the Spirit, because the Spirit takes me as I am. The Spirit is inside of me, right? And that's very interesting because, like I said, both are actually talking about the Spirit and their relationship to God. Um, and different sorts of topics came out of this and of other things. So in speaking to these women, I actually got to find out exactly what they deem important to them. And contrary to popular belief, men are not that important to them. Because one of the reviews that I got in the book was, but why aren't you talking about toxic masculinity? And my only response to that was that it's because it didn't come up. Right? When I was speaking to these women, yes, there were bits and pieces of it where they actually thought that men are put on too high a pedestal. So that actually makes them scared of men, because they believe that the pressures on men to take up pastoral positions make them act in certain ways and not actually show who they truly are, what they truly think, right? And so under that pressure, that they actually only get to breathe, and in very toxic ways, in the home space when they are with their wives and children. And that was the major concern that came up there about toxic masculinity. But otherwise, other than that, they were more concerned about the kinds of networks that they actually build with each other. They are more about supporting each other. One of them said to me, I love that my sisters support me spiritually, but they also support me in my basic everyday living. And she actually used the words, they remind me to live. They remind me to be. So those are important things that come up with these sort of conversations are about women. So what happens with the discourses? What happens with the metaphors that are used to describe God? What happens when a metaphor of God is of God as a woman, right? As a femme. What happens when examples are given to young girls of Jesus who actually uplifts and empowers them? And what happens then, even in the opposite, when young girls are told to take their place? One of the pastors actually said that it's difficult to be a woman, and this is a male pastor. He said it must be difficult to be a woman because women are only going to know freedom once they get to heaven, right? And what actually happens then with girls and women who are sitting in that congregation and listening to that, and maybe internalizing the fact that freedom only will come to them when they get to heaven. And of course, what are the different ways that they choose to refuse to internalize such talks about them? Yeah, so that's my book that I could go on and on about because it's my book. But I look forward to the question and answer sessions. Thank you.
Thank you, Tumi, for that. I mean, I've been so impressed with Tumi, Siphokazi, and Polo, and I guess you said it, Tumi. It's your book. I mean, you just have no notes. You just talk. You took for 30 minutes. You're just talking without looking at your notes, and because you've lived with this work for a long time, so it's part of you. So thank you so much for that. And now we're going to Aya, because Aya's is not a book, and Aya is speaking on behalf of Danai, and it is a special issue for agenda. All right, Aya, you have 20.
20 or less, because none of these are my words. So
Less would be great.
Hi everyone. As Prof. Spencer said, I'm just a mere medium and vessel, really, to express my editor's thoughts and framing conceptions of the agenda special issue called Black Transnational Feminisms and Questions of Structure. The editors are or were Lynn Osame Atinangamso Ngomo and Danai Mupotsa. So today I've just compiled a number of thoughts that basically frame the conceptualization and the blueprint framework of how Mupotsa, Ngomo, and Osame have sort of conceived of this special edition, and how they then continue to write of it in the issue itself and in the call. None of my
you know, I was a contributor in the special issue, so I'm not a random person just reading there. You know, but because I'm going to be presenting my paper from the special issue on Saturday, I think I'll just park my own experiences with writing my paper and how I framed it to Saturday, and I'll just here, you know, evoke most of Danai's thinking, and also Osama and Ati as well. So Danai, when she sort of explains to me and she asks me to present sort of her own journey of how the special issue came to be, says here, it was still during the period of the COVID-19 lockdowns that the discussion of a special issue on Black transnational feminism began. The editorial committee made the suggestions of the special issue on Black Lives Matter because of their concurrent times, so to speak. I was working on the special issue, or at the end of agenda, co-edited with Moshibudi Mudumela on the intimacies of COVID-19, where, you know, they were both completely overwhelmed with, let me say, us as a public, particularly since I'd been diagnosed with meningomia in the middle of the project and along with the postponements of the process due to the pandemic. Having brain surgery and recovering was another strain. Like many of us, the last few years have been very punctuated with loss. At the time when we closed that issue, my mother, Prof. Peterson, and my beloved friend, Pierre Paolo, who many people, all three of them in the audience, would also have known and loved, was sitting with me. All three of these people passed on in the wake of the pandemic. The suggestions for an issue on Black Lives Matter, like in many cases when a topic comes up, likely due to its currency at the time. We see this habit across the board when something gathers intensity around it, and this is enough to rationalize anyone's interest or further authority and expertise in the topic. My own article, I had initially submitted to a different special issue on Black Lives Matter, where the process that resulted in me withdrawing it was completely based on the basis of a lack of expertise within any fields of Black intellectual traditions. This lack of conceptual fluency did not seem to be a prior requirement to address the topic for many people and in many disciplines, because the approach of a topic, a critical aspect of how anti-Blackness operates institutionally and systematically. Of course, this is also connected to the role of major corporations taking over small journals, who of course turn to them under constraint to survive in the neoliberal present. But the depoliticizing and anti-intellectual effects are just extremely palpable. I am on the editorial committee of Agenda in its totality. So in the discussion of who can be approached to edit the special issue, in my exhaustion, I was reluctant, but I thought it might be an opportunity to think alongside a friend and colleague, Lina Summer. So I approached her initially, in part with the hope that she would lead and work with another co-editor. The editorial committee also approached Deline Miller. The three of us met a few times, but several structural constraints made this process much lengthy than is helpful. We were also working with the intention of approaching the topic with the integrity of our time and place, as well as the ethical and scholarly integrity it demands. So the discussion took a long time, and in this time, Deline was making a professional change. So still in this provisional space, Lynn and I took direction of the project. I was still reluctant, hoping for a less prominent role. So we looked to a third issue editor and approached Atinkopo. And all of it was quite serendipitous because our orientations to the question were foundational to the core, but also to the range and, in my view, the beauty of the issue in its whole at the end. I hadn't seen the CFP in much detail since it was circulated until the penning of the introduction. I was surprised by the extent to which the two meet each other. It should probably be no surprise that an issue reflects the initial call for papers, but I live a life of adventure. Who knows what can happen? The key terms in this title of the issue, Black, Transnational, Feminisms, Structure, they are all taken incredibly seriously, and they really meet the integrity of time, event, history, and power. What is assembled here and its treatment of the willfulness or horizons of possibility we might try to build the language for, that liberatory but also anticipatory grief. As I am currently writing it as or about, that this conceptual horizon is animated in many ways that I am enthralled by. The topicization, I suppose she invented a word there, but the topicization of the events when we will, for our liberation, Denise Ferrer de Silva's framing, a banalization of racial events, a consequence of the mediocrity of colonial time, the love and wonder that I share in thinking with and writing together, a practice of love that I've chosen despite that it is a bit much, this being a feature of my relationship with her late student and a late peer of mine, Eddie Ombangi. As we attempted, or Dr. Eddie Ombangi rather, as we attempted to wrap this issue up, he passed away. And the first night after, in the early morning, I dreamt of him. So I suppose the first night she had heard of this, she dreamt of him. We were printing articles for a reading group. I kept asking him to print things, and he said he couldn't. And I insisted, and he said he could not. And I insisted. I said, "It's not like you're dead." And he said, "Danai, I am." We are all grieving still. Anticipatory grief has not simply been the idiom of struggle. Even when Black Lives Matter, what is it to matter? Or rather, it raises the questions, what is it to matter? What is matter? Or the reading together, thinking together that animate any kind of movement that tries to imagine until it is almost immediately captured. But it is also what the framing of the issue looks like. And I think I should comment here that something I do appreciate about Danai as my teacher, I mean, she still remains my teacher, as many of my teachers are, is that she always has this ethic of integrating communities of her students, not just communities of her peers and friends, but also the communities of her students in the work that she's doing, and she's very, I think she's very intentional about that, because this call attracted a lot of, graduate students like myself. And I think for me, and I know for some of my peers who contributed to this, this was our first, published journal articles, or these were our first journal articles that were published. And so, there's an incredible ethic in how she chooses to curate her career, and especially her editorial career, which is very commendable. And even her, invoking the spirit and the work, not just the spirit in memory, but the work of Eddie Ombangi, in the introduction, and committing the journal to him is something that, speaks a lot to her character as a thinker and as a teacher and as a community worker. So basically this conception, or this conceptualization rather, that they had conjured with Lynn and Ati culminates into this call, right? What they call a conceptual rationale, which we'll see shortly in Danai's introduction. They say the aim of this special issue is to offer situated contemplations of transnational movements in defiance of Black lives and against anti-Blackness. So not just Black Lives Matter as a movement, but the idea of what it means to bring the mattering of Black life, or Black matter in life, to the fore of our thinking. And I said here, you see here in the reworking of the initial conceptualization of the call, around BLM, and then they sprouted out to, solidarities, transnational solidarities, and the mattering of Black life, rather. And they say here, we ask, what ways does the history of a people shape the nature of their demands? In other words, how does structural power shape both the modes of domination and the modes of resistance against it? This is a question that haunts the boundaries of Black transnational feminist organizing, often necessarily complicating the narratives through which we understand the nature and the character of Black feminist movements across spatial and historical distance. How, for instance, our struggles nuanced by various points of proximity to power. How does transnational feminist solidarity account for structural inequalities between those located in advanced capitalist countries and those in the peripheries? Here we are concerned with the emergence of the third world through imperialist processes that encompass the spectrum of cultural, economic, and political consequences and the uneven development that they're entrenched. Black transnational feminist solidarities are an important lens through which to examine the historical trajectory as a structure of domination that is not necessarily transcended by virtue of location in the global north. The social basis of transnational solidarity also emerges in the debate as a crucible of the political relevance of transnational feminist movements. That is, at the core of our insistence that Black lives do matter is the social question and critique of the structures, conditions, and institutions that reproduce Black life as immaterial. We offer a space for reflections on the social and cultural basis of our shared demands and visions of liberation. That is, what is it in our present and historical context that land us to the continuities and affinities of speech, i.e., prose, poetry, music, dance, healing practices, despite the reality of our unequal integration into the post-colonial world order? How do the structural inequalities that organize the worlds we inhabit complicate and rationalize transnational feminist politics and solidarities? Still on speech, we might also inquire into the fate of the transnational feminist subject who speaks from the furthest margins of the state and its neoliberal capitalist economic structures, those people who are so far removed from the logics of capitalism that to speak of or for them in the dominant register of feminism and power is to altogether erase the nature of their subjectivity. In other words, what does poverty, inequality, and suffering structure relationships of solidarity in Black transnational feminist movements? So that basically was the call. And in Danai's introduction of the issue, she says that from this call emanate, 6 different themes from the papers, and then she makes descriptions of how different contributors, spoke to those themes. I mean, I suppose these are spontaneous themes that emerge from the call. And I'll just read the themes. I think I'm out of time, so I won't. Oh, just 5 minutes. Okay, so the themes and maybe a few quotes from that. So the themes are prophetic organization, vertigo, reproductivity, puzzles of consciousness, terror of solidarity, which comes from Afro-pessimist feminist thinking, and finally, the banality of the racialized event. So let me just read how she reads how some of the combination of these themes. So of prophetic organization, she speaks of Mupotsa, who's one of the contributors, a peer of mine and a student of Danai as well, and how Mupotsa basically reads the multiple symbolic registers rooted in the temporal schema of which is also read as freedom, as the problem space, event space, and an index that is unresolved and requires a repertoire of maneuvers to, in Mopotsa's words, to contemplate an array of problems pertaining to the nature of Blackness, its ontic qualities, the historical events that signals its foreclosures, and the political and epistemic endeavors that have yet to retrieve it from the violent womb of the world. Danai then says, much like the maneuvers to reduce race to a discursive register within the terms of non-racialism, the post-ubiquitous in reading the present demobilizes, Mopotsa continues to say, how colonialism and capitalism are integrated in the present, but not structurally interdependent, surmising that despite an apparent shift in the production of colonial enjoyment or jouissance, capitalism, that's a French word, I messed it up, yeah. Leo. Capitalism enjoys the very place of colonial pleasure. And then in the banality of racial events, Danai will then read S.M. Rodriguez' African Feminisms for abolitionist futures, archival hauntings in a speculative geography, which sets forward the task for interdependent collective agency of what Rodriguez will say of making Black Lives Matter, even in the death worlding structures of carceralism and coloniality, by way of emancipating, says Danai, emancipating penal and abolitionist theorizing from whiteness. Carceralism is the social mechanism that defines and determines spatial, temporal, and material relations constitutive of these zones of separability. And then lastly, one theme that she also looks at is how Atinangamso replays Atinangamso Gopo replays, the Pinky Pinky folkloric figure, township folkloric figure, and how she reads Pinky Pinky into Hortense Spiller's reanalysis of Freudian psychoanalysis. And yeah, I mean, there's a number of ways that she really beautifully and generously discusses these themes, and how all of these themes sort of speak to Black transnational feminisms and the question of structures, and possibly even the futures of feminist, thinking and theorizing in South Africa. Yeah. None of those were my words.
Thank you, Aya, on behalf of for reading. We can hear that those are the nice words. So thank you so much, Aya, for reading the nice contribution to this. And now, can you please give them all a round of applause? And I think agendas you can access through your libraries. If you don't have your libraries, online, but not now.
And sorry, Danai asked me to announce that the special issue is it's free online for just 1 week. For the next week.
Which week?
I'm not sure. She just said. But she said if you have questions, please email her. And the email is danai.mupotsa@wits.ac.za.
All right, we'll ask her which week.
Yeah.
It's this week. We really need
I
it.
think if it's to be announced, it's now.
Yeah, she said.
Download it tonight.
Okay, go and download the book. Go and
maybe
download
next
it
week.
tonight. Yeah, let us know. Yes, thanks. All right. Okay, we're not yet done. We're going upstairs to seminar room 3 for a creative performance. And by the time you get back here, there will be wine and cocktails and dinner snacks for dinner. So there will be something to eat. So can we please all go upstairs? No, we don't have time. So, but they're here. You can ask them. Over dinner, you can come and ask them. You will find them. Yes, Puma. Yes, Puma. Let's go. We'll ask